Let me give you a scenario that sounds completely impossible. A radical political party seizes power in a coup. They control 2 cities in a country that spans 11 time zones. Immediately, every major power on Earth, Britain, France, the United States, Japan, declares them illegitimate and starts sending troops, weapons, and money to destroy them. The country's old military officer class, its noble families, its Cossack warriors, its moderate politicians, all of them take up arms against the new regime. The new government has no army, no functioning economy, no gold reserves, and very little popular support outside of a few industrial cities. Now tell me who wins. Most people looking at that situation objectively would say the new government doesn't survive 6 months. But the Bolsheviks survived. Not just survived, they won completely, totally. By 1922, every single enemy they had was dead, in exile, or broken. The Soviet Union was declared, and the regime that couldn't last 6 months lasted until 1991. This is the story of how. This is the story of the Russian Civil War, the most consequential armed conflict of the 20th century that most Americans have never actually sat down and understood. And the answer to why the whites lost, the real answer, not the textbook version, is a lot more interesting than you probably think. Let's start at the very beginning. To understand the Civil War, you have to understand what Russia looked like in 1917. Because the whites didn't lose in 1919 or 1920. The seeds of their defeat were planted years before the first shot was fired. Russia in 1914 was a country under enormous strain. Tsar Nicholas II was an autocrat in a world moving rapidly toward democratic governance. He was personally decent and genuinely devoted to his family, but he was catastrophically unsuited to the demands of modern statecraft. He believed with total sincerity that he ruled by divine right and that the Russian people needed a firm paternal hand, not a parliament, not representation, not reform. Then World War I arrived. Russia entered the war with an army that was enormous in numbers and inadequate in almost everything else. The supply chains were broken, the artillery shells ran out. The officer class was decimated in the first months of fighting. By 1915, Russian soldiers were being sent to the front with no rifles and told to pick up weapons from their fallen comrades. The army began to disintegrate. Not dramatically, gradually, then all at once. By 1917, mutinies were spreading. Desertion was epidemic. And the Tsar, in one of the most catastrophically ill-judged decisions of the entire war, had taken personal command of the Russian forces. Which meant that every defeat was now personally his fault in the eyes of his own people. In March 1917, the February Revolution broke out. Street protests over food shortages in Petrograd became a general uprising. The army refused to fire on the crowds. And Nicholas II, the absolute ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's surface, abdicated his throne to a provisional government and disappeared into house arrest with his family. The old order had collapsed. The question was what would replace it. The provisional government, liberal politicians, and moderate socialists tried to hold Russia together while continuing to fight the war. They promised elections, they promised reform. And then they made one fatal, catastrophic error. They stayed in the war. The Russian people were done with the war. They had been done with it since 1915. They wanted peace, land, and bread. The provisional government offered them continued sacrifice for a war that had already killed millions. The Bolsheviks offered something different: peace, land, bread, 3 words. That was the promise. And in October 1917, they seized the moment. The October Revolution was, in many ways, a remarkably bloodless event. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin and organized militarily by Leon Trotsky, simply seized key buildings in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, the telegraph stations, the railway hubs. The provisional government barely resisted. But the ease of the seizure disguised a fundamental problem. The Bolsheviks were a minority party that had just stolen a revolution from the people who had actually made it. They had gotten about 25% of the vote in recent elections. The Socialist Revolutionaries, a rival socialist party with deep roots among the peasantry, had gotten far more. When the Constituent Assembly met in January 1918 and showed that the Bolsheviks didn't actually have a majority, Lenin simply dissolved it. One of Russia's first experiments with democratic representation lasted exactly one day before Lenin shut it down. This created enemies, not just on the right, but everywhere across the political spectrum. The people who rose up against the Bolsheviks were not a unified force. And that right there is the first and most important reason the whites eventually lost. Who are the whites? The name is almost misleadingly simple. The White Army was not an army. It was 5 or 6 different armies fighting in completely different parts of Russia with completely different goals, led by completely different men, who often despised each other nearly as much as they despised the Bolsheviks. In Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak proclaimed himself supreme ruler of Russia. A former naval commander, he had the support of British military advisors and American equipment. He was personally brave and genuinely patriotic. He was also a deeply authoritarian figure who alienated almost everyone he governed. In the south, General Anton Denikin commanded the Volunteer Army, a force built from former Imperial officers and Cossacks, fighting to reclaim Ukraine and southern Russia. Denikin was a more moderate figure than Kolchak. But his army committed atrocities, particularly against Jewish populations, that made the white cause look like a return to the worst aspects of imperial rule. In the northwest, General Nikolai Yudenich made 2 attempts to march on Petrograd from Estonia. He came agonizingly close the second time, close enough that Bolshevik government officials began burning documents. But he failed to coordinate with Kolchak or Denikin, and without coordinated pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, his army was driven back. In the Crimea, General Pyotr Rangel, the last significant white commander, made a final stand. He was perhaps the most capable of all the white generals. But by the time he was in command, it was already too late. 5 different armies, 5 different fronts, almost no coordination. Almost no common political vision. And all of them fighting against an opponent that, despite its weakness, had one enormous advantage. It controlled the center. When Lenin appointed Leon Trotsky as Commissar of War in March 1918, the Red Army was not an army. It was a collection of revolutionary militias, enthusiastic, ideologically committed, and militarily useless. Trotsky understood immediately what needed to happen. And he did something that infuriated many old Bolsheviks. He hired former Tsarist officers, not dozens, thousands. By the end of the Civil War, approximately 50,000 former officers of the Imperial Russian Army were serving in the Red Army. Trotsky's reasoning was coldly practical. These men knew how to fight. The revolutionary militias didn't. You could teach ideology later. You couldn't teach military competence in the middle of a war. To prevent defection or sabotage, Trotsky assigned political commissars, trusted Bolsheviks, to monitor every military unit. If a former Tsarist officer defected, his family would face consequences. It was brutal. It was effective. Trotsky also restored discipline with a ruthlessness that shocked even his own side. Desertion was punished by execution, not occasionally but systematically. Units that retreated without orders were subjected to decimation. Every 10th man shot. This was Rome's most ancient military punishment, resurrected in the 20th century by a revolutionary government desperate to hold an army together. But Trotsky's most important contribution wasn't any single policy. It was his understanding of momentum and morale. He traveled the front lines on his famous armored train, a rolling command post, appearing personally at critical moments, rallying troops, resolving disputes, inspiring and terrorizing in equal measure. He was brilliant. He was terrifying, and he built an army of 5 million men from almost nothing in 3 years. Here's the thing that most people miss about the Russian Civil War. About 80% of the Russian population were peasants. Farmers, people who lived in villages, worked the land, and had very little connection to the ideological debates happening in Petrograd and Moscow. For these people, the Civil War was not about communism versus democracy. It was about one question and one question only: who is going to let us keep the land? For centuries, the Russian peasantry had worked land they did not own. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 had technically freed them, but hadn't given them the land. The Bolsheviks, immediately after seizing power, issued their land decree. The land was to be redistributed to the peasants. The estates of the nobility were broken up and handed to the people who worked them. This was popular, enormously popular. Not because the peasants had suddenly become Bolsheviks, most of them had almost no idea what Bolshevism meant. But they had the land now, and whoever threatened to take it back was their enemy. The White Army threatened to take it back. Not explicitly perhaps, but in practice, the Whites were led by former nobles and imperial officers. When White armies advanced into an area, landlords returned with them, demanding their property back. The peasants understood what a White victory would mean: the old order restored, the land taken back. So the peasants, despite hating the Bolsheviks' grain requisitioning, despite sometimes actively fighting against Red Army conscription, ultimately chose the Reds. Not because they loved communism, because they feared the return of what came before it. This was the Bolsheviks' single greatest strategic advantage, and it wasn't something they had planned. It was something they fell into by accident and then exploited brilliantly. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan all intervened militarily in Russia during the Civil War. The stated reason was to reopen the Eastern Front against Germany. Russia had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, withdrawing from World War I and ceding enormous territory to Germany. The Allies wanted Russia back in the fight. But the war ended in November 1918, and the Western powers kept intervening anyway. Now the reason was stopping Bolshevism from spreading. From a purely military standpoint, the intervention was underwhelming. British troops landed at Murmansk. American troops landed at Archangel and Vladivostok. Japanese forces pushed deep into Siberia. They sent weapons and advisors to White commanders. But they never committed the kind of sustained military force that would have been necessary to actually determine the outcome. What the intervention did accomplish, with remarkable efficiency, was to hand the Bolsheviks their most powerful propaganda tool. Suddenly, the Bolsheviks, who had seized power in a coup and dissolved the only democratically elected assembly Russia had ever had, were able to position themselves as the defenders of Russia against foreign invasion. They were fighting for the motherland. The Whites, by accepting British gold and American weapons and Japanese troops on Russian soil, had made themselves look like agents of foreign powers trying to dismember Russia. In a country with deep nationalist feelings, this mattered enormously. Russians who had no particular love for Bolshevism and no particular hatred of the old order could still understand. Foreign soldiers on Russian soil meant something had to be resisted. And the Bolsheviks were the ones doing the resisting. It was a gift, the Western powers had paid for it themselves. By early 1919, Admiral Kolchak in Siberia commanded the largest White Army force. He had British advisors, substantial Western arms shipments, and a territory that stretched across the vast expanse of Siberia to the Pacific coast. His spring offensive of 1919 was briefly successful. His armies drove westward, and for a few weeks it seemed like a real possibility that the Whites might reach Moscow before the Reds could stop them. Then everything unraveled. Kolchak's government in Omsk was, by most accounts, a disaster. The political administration he ran was corrupt, brutal, and alienated almost every potential ally. His officers treated Siberian peasants as enemies to be looted, rather than citizens to be governed. Conscription was enforced through violence. Grain requisitioning, the same policy that made the Bolsheviks hated, was practiced just as harshly in White-controlled territory. There was no coherent ideology beyond not Bolshevism, no land reform. No economic program, no vision for what Russia would look like after a White victory. Just the demand that people sacrifice and suffer for a cause that the White leadership couldn't clearly articulate. The Red Army counterattacked in the summer of 1919. Kolchak's forces collapsed faster than anyone expected. The retreat turned into a rout. Kolchak himself was eventually captured, tried by a revolutionary tribunal in Irkutsk, and shot in February 1920. His body was pushed through a hole in the ice of the Angara River. In Siberia, the White cause was finished. While Kolchak was collapsing in the east, General Denikin's armed forces of South Russia were having the greatest success any white commander would achieve. In the summer and fall of 1919, Denikin's armies swept north from Ukraine and the Caucasus. They captured Orel, a city just 250 miles south of Moscow. For a few weeks in October 1919, Denikin's forces were closer to Moscow than any white army had ever been. The Bolshevik leadership genuinely panicked. There are accounts of government officials preparing evacuation plans. The fall of Moscow seemed possible, then once again the same thing happened. As Denikin's armies advanced, the territory behind them descended into chaos. Pogroms erupted against Jewish communities, organized massacres carried out by units nominally under white command. Tens of thousands of Jewish civilians were killed. This wasn't incidental to the white cause, it was symptomatic of it. The whites couldn't control their own forces, couldn't establish functional government, couldn't win the population. And Denikin, like Kolchak, had neglected to coordinate with his fellow white commanders. His supply lines stretched impossibly thin as he advanced, his flanks were exposed. The Red Army, fighting on interior lines with the advantage of the railway network centered on Moscow, could shift forces faster than Denikin could anticipate. Trotsky orchestrated a counteroffensive that caught Denikin's overextended forces in detail. The advance shattered. By early 1920, Denikin's armies were in full retreat toward the Black Sea coast. He evacuated at Novorossiysk, leaving tens of thousands of his own soldiers behind, and resigned command to Wrangel. In the south it was over. Let's talk about something uncomfortable, because it's part of the story. The Bolsheviks were not gentle victors. The Red Terror, implemented by the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police under Felix Dzerzhinsky, killed enormous numbers of people during the Civil War. Estimates range from 50,000 to well over 1 million, depending on how you count. Executions, mass arrests, hostage-taking. Class-based repression where simply being from the wrong background could get you shot. The whites were not innocent either. White atrocities, particularly the pogroms against Jews, and the brutal reprisals against civilian populations suspected of Bolshevik sympathies, matched and in many regions exceeded the Bolshevik terror. So why does this matter to the question of who won? Because the Bolsheviks' terror, however horrific, was centrally directed and served a strategic purpose. It eliminated specific enemies, enforced compliance, and built a coherent state apparatus. The Cheka was an instrument of a government with goals. The White Terror was anarchic. It came from undisciplined armies that couldn't be controlled, from commanders who looked the other way while their men committed atrocities. From a movement that had ideology vague enough to include everyone and coherent enough to include no one. Terror without purpose alienates. Terror with purpose, however evil, consolidates. The Bolsheviks understood this. The whites never did. By late 1920, only one significant white force remained. General Wrangel's army in Crimea. He had perhaps 150,000 men behind the fortified Perekop Isthmus, the narrow land bridge connecting Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland. Wrangel was the most capable white commander. He tried, belatedly, to do what his predecessors had refused. Implement land reform in white-controlled territory, reach out to Ukrainian nationalists. Build some kind of political program beyond simple anti-Bolshevism. He was a better leader than Kolchak or Denikin. He had also been given an impossible situation. His army was the last remnant of a cause that had already been lost. The Western powers, exhausted, domestically pressured by socialist and labor movements who opposed the intervention, were withdrawing support. In November 1920, the Red Army stormed the Perekop. The fortifications fell. Wrangel organized a massive evacuation, roughly 150. 0 people boarded ships at Sevastopol and the other Crimean ports, sailing into exile. It was the end, not just of the White Army, of a Russia. The people on those ships, soldiers, officers, nobles, intellectuals, artists, engineers, would become the Russian diaspora in Paris, Berlin, Shanghai, New York. They would spend the rest of their lives maintaining that what they had lost still existed somewhere. That the Russia they knew was waiting to be reclaimed. It never was. So here's the answer to the question we started with. Why did the whites lose? Not because they had fewer guns, they had plenty of guns. Not because they had fewer soldiers, they had those too. Not because they lacked foreign support. Britain and France and America and Japan spent enormous resources supporting the white cause. The whites lost because they were 5 different armies fighting for 5 different visions of Russia that had almost nothing in common. They lost because their political leadership couldn't articulate a vision of Russia that ordinary people, the 80% who were peasants, wanted to live in. They lost because they accepted foreign support in ways that made them look like agents of foreign powers dismembering Russia rather than Russians fighting for Russia. They lost because Leon Trotsky was a military genius and they had no equivalent. They lost because the Bolsheviks, for all their brutality, had a clear ideology that told them exactly what they were fighting for and gave them the discipline and cohesion to fight for it. And they lost because the Bolsheviks controlled the center. Moscow, Petrograd, the railways, the armaments factories, the population. Interior lines of communication that let them fight in one direction, then pivot and fight in another, while white armies 1,000 miles apart couldn't even talk to each other. The Civil War that ended in 1922 didn't just create the Soviet Union. It shaped everything the Soviet Union became: the paranoia, the authoritarianism, the siege mentality, the belief that enemies were everywhere and terror was necessary to survive. All of that came from these years, from a government that fought for its life surrounded by enemies and won by being more ruthless than anyone else. The Soviet Union was built on this war. And in ways that historians are still unraveling, it was destroyed by it too. 7 to 12 million dead, a country remade from its foundation, and a century of consequences that we're still living with today.